There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. This is a phrase that's sometimes attributed to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who actually probably never really said it, but nevertheless, it sounds pretty cool. And also, even more importantly, it could hardly be more true than right now. And it almost perfectly captures the situation that we're living through. As I'm recording this, Donald Trump has cut off aid to Ukraine. And depending on when are you watching this, he might have also said or done a bunch of other previously unimaginable things. But regardless of what he's going to do in the future, what has already happened is quite clear. Donald Trump completely reversed 80 years of the US post war policy, and in one stroke and in just a few weeks, he changed the reality in which Europe has been living in for 8 decades almost entirely. And the new reality in which we live now is that Europe is alone, in the sense that it cannot rely on the US not just for protection, but not for any help whatsoever. And even though so far it has been mostly about cutting aid to Ukraine, it really goes beyond that. Trump clearly doesn't see the value in not just helping Ukraine, but also in the United States being in NATO and alliance with Europe or alliances in general. And you cannot rely on someone who doesn't see the value in helping you. Because then, if Europe would ever need help, Trump might, for example, say that he would help us, but only in exchange for Greenland or something else that we really don't want to give away. Because if you don't see the value in helping your allies stay safe, or even having allies in the first place, then everything is just a transaction. And if everything is just a transaction, then you're not really having alliances. You're just paying for protection, or demanding to be paid for protection, depending on which side you're sitting on. It's like the difference of whether safety in your neighborhood is maintained by the police or by a local mafia. Because maybe in some instances the end result would be same or similar, but the price you end up paying and the rules that you're going to be playing by are very different. And while there's still many Americans who do value the transatlantic alliance, it seems that roughly half of the US political spectrum, aka the Republicans, share views of the US president. And so this mentality is likely not going anywhere. And from a European perspective, hoping that after Trump there might be someone more reliable would be kind of insane. Especially since it more and more looks like the successor to Donald Trump on the Republican side would be J.D. Vance, who's if anything, even more radical than Donald Trump himself. And so, unfortunately, it looks like that after 8 decades, the West, as we knew it, the collective of democracies that help each other because of shared values, is over. Because the most important member is just not part of it anymore. And so, the natural question that is now being asked in many European capitals, and by the way, the same question will apply to a lot of other US allies and partners elsewhere, but since Europe is the only one with a war on its doorstep, let's start here, is this. Can Europe survive on its own without the United States, whether it comes to helping Ukraine to survive or defending the borders of what's left of NATO? And well, historically, many have been very skeptical to this question. But I believe it can. And so I want to dig deeper into that and try to answer not just whether it can survive and why I think it can, but also what it would take and what would need to be done in order for it to happen. And to me, that question of whether Europe can survive has two parts, a question of ability and a question of willingness. If we start with the question of ability, of whether Europe is able to defend itself, the classic narrative has been that Europe has not been spending money on military, that it didn't take its defense seriously, and so as a result, it's not really capable of anything when it comes to its own defense and security. And that is partly true. We have spent very little. Our militaries are hugely underfunded, they have huge internal debts, and they're tiny, understaffed. Our military production is small and slow, and overall, Europe, when it comes to defense, is just a shadow of its own, a shadow of what it has been even during the Cold War. But that narrative, this story that we tell ourselves about our own capability, is only really describing a small part of the reality. And as a result, it's not exactly accurate. Measuring how strong different states are compared to each other is always a little tricky, since national power, if we call it that way, has quite a lot of components, and not all of them are entirely quantifiable. But essentially, it comes down to a few fairly simple things. How big is your population? How big is your economy? How efficient and competent are you in running and managing things? And how willing you are to dedicate the economy to defense. And Europe has had and still has a huge problem in one of these areas, in using the money. But in others, whether it's the size of the population, size of the economy, level of technology and educated population that we have at our disposal, it's doing pretty well. The fact is that Europe has a large population, it has a large economy, and a lot of high tech industries. And even though we haven't been spending on defense, we have the ability and the foundations that you need to be a major power. Now, there is one big issue. We often talk about Europe as if it was a country, but it's not. And it's not just Americans who do that, it's us Europeans as well. But as obvious it is, it's good to emphasize it because the fact that Europe is not a single country makes everything a lot more complicated and inefficient. EU, the organization which most of European countries are members of, is not a defense or military organization. It doesn't have its own military. It doesn't do things like buying military equipment in bulk together, and it doesn't even have a unified foreign policy. And the fact is that as an organization, it wasn't built for any of those things. And even though some of them are now starting to be implemented, it's still very much in the earliest stages. And while we have NATO, which is a defense organization, the way it's set up, it's very much dependent on leadership of the United States. After all, it was founded by the United States. And for example, the Supreme Military Commander Europe, which is the official title for the person who's actually in charge within NATO of all the military operations and who'd be indispensable in case that NATO Article 5 were ever activated, that person has always been and always will be an American. And there's a lot of other details throughout NATO where the US presence, US leadership, and US personnel are inherently indispensable. And on top of that, NATO is also designed for leading a coordinated defense of a large number of national militaries fighting together, but not really for building a unified army. So it's good to keep in mind that even though we say that Europe should do that or Europe should do this, Europe doesn't actually do anything. It's always 20 to 30 countries that first have to agree on something, which is already pretty complicated, and then do it individually, each of them, while hoping that all of them will actually really do it, which makes everything slower, more difficult, and less efficient. But even so, even despite all that, Europe is undoubtedly still large and wealthy enough that being able to defend itself from Russia or any other threat really shouldn't be that hard. And after all, the joke about 500 million Europeans who are desperately asking the 340 million Americans to protect them from the 140 million Russians who are unsuccessfully fighting 40 million Ukrainians is a pretty good description of the situation. And so it really comes down to question number two, the question of willingness. Because Europe is able to do a lot. It could definitely defend itself against Russia. And it could even beef up Ukraine to be able to win this war, or at least to survive. It's not that it's not able to do it, it's that it might not decide that it actually wants to do that. And that's weird, right? It seems pretty obvious what Europe should do, that it should do it, and that it can do it. So why does it seem like it's just not able to? Why do we still see so many words and so little action? Why do we keep talking about wake-up calls for Europe that do not seem to be happening? And why does there still seem to be a tendency in Europe, even now, to rely on the US, when it's quite clear that this is not a great idea? This is the end of the free part, but you can find the full version on Patreon. As a patron, you'll also get full ad-free interviews with fantastic guests and the chance to ask them your own question, and exclusive Patreon-only analysis on geopolitics. And you'll also be joining a great community of people who care deeply about geopolitics, strategy, and defense, all while directly supporting my work. If that sounds good, you can join us on Patreon using the link in the description, and if not, I'll see you next time.